Thank you all for coming. I'm Kobe Loop. I'm one of the 2 student fellows in the Criminal Justice Program of Study. Actually, it's now the Criminal Justice Program of Study, Research, and Advocacy. And we're actually looking for next year's student fellow. So if any of you are 2Ls or 1Ls and are interested in that, keep an eye out for our weekly email. There will be a posting about that. We hope you'll apply if you're interested. I want to just thank the Dean for supporting this event. It's being co-sponsored by both Criminal Justice Program and the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice. So what I'm going to do is just introduce Michael Bromwich and Ronald Hampton, who we're so pleased to have with us today. And then after Mr. Bromwich gives some remarks about the report that he's here presenting today, there will be a bit of a conversation with David Harris, who's the managing director of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute, kind of moderating, and Professor Hyman, who is a well-known professor here, also giving some input. So I'll try to keep this brief. Although Mr. Bromwich has done a lot in his career, he is now he's the founder of the Bromwich Group, an independent consulting group, but he's also been a assistant U.S. attorney, white-collar defense attorney. He prosecuted Oliver North in the Iran-Contra affair, inspector general at the DOJ. But most relevant for today, he was from 2002 to 2008 the independent monitor for the District of Columbia's Metropolitan Police Department. So what he's presenting today is a report that I think looks back and assesses how the reforms worked, how well they worked, what the continuing challenges are. And Mr. Hampton, he spent 23 years as a community relations officer at MPD, so I imagine he'll have some interesting reflections to share too. He's most recently the executive director of the National Black Police Association. He now serves on several boards for several organizations, and speaks all over the world on issues of policing and community relations. And Mr. Bromwich also graduated from the school in 1980, I forgot to mention. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Bromwich.
Well, thank you very much. I think this will work, right? So it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to a discussion with you about the report that we published earlier this year. So the report was published at the end of January of 2016, and it reflected about 8 or 9 months of work that I did along with a very small team comprised of policing experts, both of whom had worked with me on monitoring the DC Police Department, as Kobe mentioned, from 2002 to 2008. I was hired by the DC auditor to look at, given the national conversation currently going on about policing and use of force, how was DC doing after having been under federal investigation, federal monitoring for 6 years, having come out the other side of the monitoring with a success story? They were found by my team to be in substantial compliance. How are they doing 7 years later? A very interesting question that is applicable to lots of cities that have gone through this process and lots more that are currently going through the process. Those that have finished the process include, among others, LA, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Detroit. To my knowledge, this is the first assessment of a police department so many years after the federal oversight ended. Oversight ended in 2008. We didn't start looking at things until 2015, so 7 years had gone by before we started taking a look at things. Before I talk about what the findings were in the report, let me give you a little bit of the history. In late 1998, there was a devastating 5-part series in the Washington Post about MPD, the DC Police Department. And the series of articles, and I'm not sure what prompted them, was an incredibly negative portrait of the police department as poorly managed. Use of force was out of control. There were no credible internal investigations done when there were allegations of misconduct against officers. And even in the small number of cases where there were investigations and the allegations were substantiated, there was no discipline. These cases fell through the cracks. So that was the gist of the articles, in addition to scary things like practice of shooting at moving cars, an incredibly dangerous law enforcement practice that had been outlawed in many jurisdictions before then. So Chuck Ramsey, who I'm sure many of you know at least his name if you haven't dealt with him, had been a lifelong police officer in Chicago. He had come to D.C. in the spring of that year, 1998, to help with a department that was known to be in trouble, in part because of some serious corruption issues. And he came in, and 6 months later, he had these devastating set of articles. And so he did a remarkably bold and brave thing. Rather than defending the department or defending himself, he walked down the block to the Justice Department and said, I understand you have a program authorized under the Violent Crime Act where the Civil Rights Division investigates police departments for potential pattern and practice of civil rights violations. I'd like you to investigate my department, because I knew things were bad, but I didn't think they were this bad. And so that was the first time, and I think one of the only times, where the initiation was by the police chief and by the city. So the Civil Rights Division undertook about a 2-year-long investigation, and they substantiated most of the negative things that were in those Washington Post articles. Yes, use of force policies were outdated. Yes, there were no consistent policies and practices of doing use of force investigations. Yes, the disciplinary system was broken. Yes, the training function was not what it should be. So they produced their report, and I think as partly a reward to Chief Ramsey and the city for voluntarily coming forward, there was not a consent decree under federal court supervision, but instead a voluntary memorandum of agreement. I don't think anybody behaved differently because it was a voluntary agreement than if it had been a consent decree, but I think it was a tool that the department used in that case, in part as a reward for Chief Ramsey and the city coming forward. So what the memorandum of agreement required, it had about 128 substantive requirements. It was extraordinarily detailed. In retrospect, I would argue probably too detailed. Every jot and tittle of use of force policies, procedures, training, discipline was covered, and some of those requirements proved to be somewhat impractical in the implementation. The agreement was announced with great fanfare by then Attorney General Ashcroft, as well as the then mayor of Washington and Chief Ramsey. And what was required was the joint selection of an independent monitor to oversee the reforms that the police department and the city had agreed under the agreement to implement. And I was fortunate enough to be picked as the independent monitor. So we started our monitoring in the spring of 2002. I had a small team, a couple of lawyers, but mostly police practices experts, people who had done kind of internal affairs, use of force investigations and so forth in other departments, and who I was satisfied had the skill and the experience and the knowledge to be of enormous assistance to me. And so over the course of 6 years, we reviewed and assessed and evaluated all aspects of the memorandum of agreement. We declared the department to be in substantial compliance in 2008. We thought that even though not every requirement had been lived up to, that most of them had, and that as for the rest, the trajectory was right, and we had confidence that the department would continue on the path to reform. And so our job was really done that time around in 2008. This most recent review came up quite by surprise to me. I was contacted by the DC auditor, who Ron probably remembers was Kathy Patterson, who was a very well-known city councilman who was extremely interested in the police department and oversight over the police department. And she contacted me and said, look, given the national conversation that's going on these issues, I think it's time for somebody to take a look back at the DC department to see how the reforms have survived, whether they've survived, in the intervening 7 years. She said, is that the kind of work you do? I said, yeah, it is, and I'd love to do it. So I was fortunate enough to get two of the policing experts, one the former chief in Charlotte, North Carolina, and a woman who had been the superintendent here in Boston, the number 3 position in the department here to come back and with me review how MPD was doing. And the parameters of the assignment were, are they still in compliance with the memorandum of agreement, even in the absence of any legal obligation to remain in compliance? And are their policies, practices, procedures still best practices in law enforcement? So our review, the active part of the review was really May through early October, and then for several months we had some back and forth with MPD, got some additional documents, and we drafted the report. It's a lengthy report. You have, I think, available to you the executive summary, and we ended up with 38 recommendations, 28 of which the department accepted. They took issue with a number of the recommendations. They thought we were off base on some of them. Some of them they just weren't prepared to accept. So what did we find after all these years? There were both positive and negative findings. Positive findings were, number one, that we didn't find any evidence of a large excessive use of force problem. There had been a huge excessive use of force problem back in the 90s, and that was found by the Justice Department investigation from 1999 to 2001. The level of firearms use was way down, the number of officer-involved fatal shootings way down, and the numbers were on the same trajectory for most other uses of force: canines, spray, batons, and so forth. We also found that the use of force policies and procedures, they certainly hadn't been changed, they hadn't been rolled back. And with a couple of tweaks that we recommended, we found them to be consistent still with best practices in policing. And finally, and importantly, we found that the leadership in the person of Chief Lanier and her command staff were still committed to the reforms and to constitutional policing. But there were some negative findings. First negative finding, and a significant one, was we found that the department had changed its use of force reporting thresholds, lowering the thresholds and therefore reducing the number of less serious uses of force that were required to be reported and investigations. What do I mean by that? So obviously, use of firearms, no change. Use of spray, no change. Use of canines, no spray. It's the less serious uses of force includes takedowns, individual and group takedowns. I'm sure many of you saw the video of the tennis player James Blake being tackled in New York. That is a takedown, and I think by anybody's definition is a use of force. That is no longer required to be investigated, and right now no longer required to be reported, although MPD did accept our recommendation that they will begin again to at least report individual and group takedowns. Originally, under the memorandum of agreement, every use of force more serious than unresisted handcuffing. So if Professor Hyman has committed a crime and I go up to him and he doesn't resist the handcuffing, there was at no time any requirement that that be recorded or investigated as a use of force. But if he, as he's fully capable of doing, fights with me, I'm the police officer, and so it becomes a resisted handcuffing, that was required to be reported as a use of force and also investigated as a use of force. So that was a serious change, particularly with respect to takedowns, I would argue. Second, and this was not the sole fault or responsibility of the police department, this was in fact largely the fault of the United States Attorney's Office in DC. There were huge delays, we found, in resolving officer-involved fatal shootings. From the time the shooting took place until the time that the U.S. Attorney's Office declined prosecution and returned the case to the police department for administrative proceedings, the average was 19 months, which was an enormous growth in the length of time. That when we were doing the monitoring from 2002 to 2008, the average time was well under a year, and in most cases close to 6 months. And the Justice Department actually allowed us to interview some of the prosecutors involved in the case. And they acknowledged that the delays were much longer, and they blamed it on some internal processes and procedures, multi-level reviews, requirements that they develop lengthy memos, which were then returned to them, the line prosecutors, multiple times for rewriting and, in some cases, further investigation. But all in all, it absolutely made no sense for these cases to be delayed this long. So this is one of the things we identified and that we made a recommendation on that the local media picked up on. And we've been told that the U.S. Attorney's Office has revised their internal procedures and that the delays will be less lengthy. We will see. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. We found, and disturbingly found, that there had been a decline in the quality of use of force investigations, a decline in the quality of training, a decline in quality control over the investigations. And I'm hoping that our describing it and assessing it in this way will cause a refocusing of effort on that issue, and things will improve in MPD as a result of that. And then finally, we found that internal oversight, the internal audit function, which from the beginning we viewed as absolutely key to continuing on the work that we were doing, that had fallen down because of a change in leadership in the internal audit function. And the result was, during a 5-year period from 2010 to 2015, the number of audits on MOA-related issues, that is, use of force policies, practices, investigations, and so forth, had sharply declined. And the quality of those few audits that were done were awful, absolutely awful. More recently, in 2015, the person who was originally in charge of that function, whose work we had reviewed and, in fact, we had mentored, was returned to that function, and we've already seen an improvement. But we sent a clear signal to MPD that that's not something that can be permitted to happen again. So what's the bottom line here? The bottom line is the reforms are still in place. They are managed by people who care. Chief Lanier was a senior member of the department during both the investigation and the monitorship. She became the police chief towards the latter part of the monitorship. And so I have some confidence that this has been a wake-up call for her and for her command staff, that they will improve some of the things that we brought to their attention. So what have been the stages of the process? It's been very interesting. And this is true, and this can be generalized really across the country. First, there's the identification of the problem. In this case, it was through news media stories. More often, it's through particular salient events, which arouses community concern and unrest. Then there's a Justice Department investigation. Frequently takes a long time, anywhere from a year to 2 years. Then there is the delicate issue of designing reforms. Usually, there is a set that they apply to all jurisdictions, but then there are some that are tailored specifically to the findings that they've made in a particular jurisdiction. And then the very long, tedious, and expensive task of implementing those reforms that fall to the police department and the city. All of these agreements, interestingly, are not only with the police department, but with the city. And I think one of the main reasons for that is because the city controls the purse strings. The department doesn't have full control over the amount of budget it's going to get. And so this was a very shrewd effort that the Justice Department made to make sure that city leadership was implicated and brought within the ambit of these agreements, so that the onus was on them to make sure that the reforms were funded adequately. Final point, and then we'll have the discussion. One of the things that was really brought home to me during this process, both the original monitorship and our recent review, is the importance of leadership, leadership from the top of the department. I think Chief Ramsey was extraordinarily brave. I'm interested in hearing from Ron how unpopular a move it was for him to call in the feds, because that's what he did. It's not usually what police departments like to have done. Extraordinarily brave to do it. and then an extraordinarily good partner to the Justice Department and to me as we did our reviews, as we did our monitoring, and as we identified issues. I only went to him one-on-one. We had monthly meetings where he brought his command staff, and I had a couple of members of my staff there. And so we met on a monthly basis to bring him and his staff, and then later Chief Lanier and her staff, up to speed on what we were finding. But on 2 occasions, I went to him with what I viewed to be very serious problems. One, use of force training got off to a very bad start. The beginning of the training was the trainer getting up and saying, we're only doing these things because the Justice Department has a gun to our head. Not exactly the way to engage police officers and convince them of the merits of training. So I went to him on that one. And then the Use of Force Review Board, which is the highest level internal entity within the police department, which adjudicates the most serious uses of force in the police department, simply wasn't being operated in the way that we thought it should have and in the way that the agreement required. That is, requiring analytic discussions of the use of force. And so I went to him and I said, I think you've got to make a change. And he did immediately. No defensiveness, no, I'm going to challenge your facts. Immediately moving into problem-solving mode. And I was very pleased to see that Chief Lanier adopted the same attitude when she came in. I mean, her mandate from the mayor was, let's get out from under federal oversight as quickly as we can. And so she put her shoulder to the wheel and got some of the little bit important stuff done that was intractable and that had taken too long to get done. And she got it done. I don't think one of these monitorships and this whole implementation of reform package can be done successfully unless you've got strong, proactive, progressive leadership at the top of a department. That's all I've got.
So again, thank you so much for being here. I think this is great. And we had some conversation earlier about some of the questions that we might want to try to cover. I want to say I feel extremely fortunate that Ron is with us. We're doing a little convening ourselves of African American police officials here this weekend, and so we have not only Ron but several other of our participants here, and we're really glad for that. And I do want to say my role is to be what we decided is kind of air traffic controller, so I'm going to although for those of you who are old enough to know about Ronald Reagan, that's a...
that means we'll strike during the middle of this, yeah.
You could be in real trouble. But I think there are a couple of things that we wanted to go over and having to do with kind of the institutional context for the original report, and I think, Ron, you have a great deal of insight on that. And then the kind of questions of institutionalizing reform over time. And Phil, I think you might have some questions about that. I also wanted to kind of add some questions about, kind of the topic of culture, structure, and the role of the community and the attitude of the community toward these reforms. So I hope we can get to some of those issues going forward. But I think, I want to kind of turn to you first, Ron, as somebody who was there and kind of have a little response.
Well, it's interesting. Thank you all. Thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this. Having been on the police department, I served in the early days. I was there from 1970 to 1994. Although after 94, I stayed very much involved. I was on the interview panel that we interviewed Ramsey when he got the job. And I had to say, for full disclosure, I was against him coming. I was opposed to the chief, for the mayor. I was opposed to the mayor hiring him. And as a matter of fact, the mayor had insisted that I sit on the panel because I was a police officer involved in the movement and very much. And I had done a lot of investigation. That's what you should do about Ramsey in Chicago. And Ramsey had been, there were people in Chicago that wanted him to replace the superintendent at that time, but the mayor didn't really care that much for Ramsey, and then chose the other brother to be the superintendent at that time, Terry Hillard.
Terry Hillard, yeah.
And so, based on my investigation, I had gone to the mayor and said, no, he's not the one for this police department. But unfortunately, money ruled and Rationale didn't. They didn't have any money to go back through the selection process, and so they ended up choosing him. But he wasn't, as a matter of history, he wasn't the first chief of police to bring in the Department of Justice or the FBI. Richard Pennington was when he went to New Orleans. He not only gave Justice Department an office in the New Orleans Police Department, but he gave the FBI an office in the New Orleans Police Department because of the level of corruption and indifference that was going on at that time, which was really much different than what was happening in Washington, D.C., because I think the average police officer in New Orleans was only making like $12,000, $15,000 a year, so corruption was so rampant, it was just unbelievable. But he wasn't. Ramsey had his own reasons, I believe. He had some selfish reasons for doing what he did. He knew what was going on at the police department, but he was an outsider. Although I don't happen to believe personally in the outsider idea, but he was coming from a police department into a city that was very different than the city in the police department of Chicago that he served in all them years. And so he needed something to sort of take control and get control of the police department because he had his own ideas about what he wanted to do. We were never a police department that was separated or divided in these regional commands and all that kind of stuff. And he wanted to do some things. Some of the things that he sort of looked at and implemented in the police department were rather progressive, but it was also about him gaining control and having control over the police department. Say, for example, in the history of our police department, no one got to be a district commander with 20 years and less. It had to be more than 20 years. He instituted policies and practices that allowed individuals to be able to be a district commander with less than 20 years. The first guy I know, Scott, was a district commander of the 4th District, the old district that Lanier was in, and he had more. He had less than that time, and there were others too, but the fact of the matter was that he got rid of people too, because if you put him there, you can take him away. But it gave him control in terms of the system, not only in terms of maybe the innovativeness of that move, but he gained control because he would move people if they didn't do what he wanted them to do or provide the necessary leadership in that district. And so he not only used that as an example, it was a very effective example. And then by decentralizing the police department the way he did, because everything was downtown, and when he came in, he decentralized it. He set up these northern rocks, southern rocks, eastern rocks, and all that stuff, got everybody out of headquarters, and then he could do it himself. And then he did something that I had never ever seen in policing at that time, and that was he hired his own personal relations person. And he didn't dismantle PIO, but PIO was for the police department. But he had his own public relations person that he went to in terms of doing certain things. Now, that was a bold move, and maybe it was the right kind of move because so he was more interested in his image, but also being able to take control of a police department that literally seen him as an outsider. And he had to be there, and he had a way to do it. In Washington, like most police departments, and maybe a little bit more in Washington, was very insular, in terms of what was going on. I know y'all probably experienced that. And those were the kind of things that happened. I just had some questions myself that I think the first one had to do with when you talk about the number of complaints and being able to reduce those complaints, were there ever any consultation with the Police Complaint Center? Because they had a mandate of publishing all of the number of complaints and the nature of the complaints and all those kind of things. Also, did they look at the jump outs, the practice of jumping out? Because that's where the majority of complaints came from. And those kind of complaints were not, there was no written report about the jump outs. And most of the time, illegal searches on the street of school children, because, I mean, that was just a practice that was just out of control. The elimination of the fit team, because they were the ones who had created the pattern and the successful results in terms of the quality of investigations and other things. And they did away with the fit team and then went back to the IED concept, which people had issue with in terms of the integrity, the quality of the work, and a whole host of other things. And so I wasn't surprised about the training because unfortunately, police don't think nobody can train them but police officers, when I disagree with that. That's just crazy. But a lot of times the instructors will say the very thing that you said he said, so I wasn't surprised about that. I'm doing this because the Justice Department tells us to do it, not because they need it. And they really need more than that, but that's what they would do. And then the negatives. I've always been aware of the negatives. And so, one of the ways of sort of consistently evaluating the leadership in the police department is to talk to the people who work for the person who's a leader. And when you talk to them, at least when I talk to them and other folk in the city, it's not a very good, we don't get a very good sort of picture of Lanier's leadership. Quite frankly, I was very surprised that she got the job because she had less than 16 years when Fenty gave her the job. But because of that, I had a real great expectation about what it was that she was going to do. Here's a woman, first real woman, because we did have a woman that was in the original pool, but first real woman, chief of police, under 16 years. She didn't owe anybody anything. They had to give her a special package even to make her chief of police because she had to work 25 years to be able to retire. But she let people down because there were things that I thought she was going to do in terms of providing leadership, and especially as a woman who had experienced sexual harassment and other things within the police department. But she really didn't, and I'm just saying that was my sort of observation of it. And then some of the the reporting process, the APO statute was really sketchy and whatnot. They're supposed to be changing that. There's been some legislation in the city that's been introduced to sort of change the APO statute. Delays. A friend of mine was involved in the shooting. It took 5 years for them to decide that he didn't do anything wrong. But by the time they decided that, he had left and moved out of the city and went to being a school teacher or something. So it was those kind of things. But I think based on the culture of the organization, they could very successfully do the kind of things that manifest itself in the reports and still very much be the same kind of police department they was before the review as well as before the original report. And Ramsey, that was key for Ramsey to be able to do that because it gave him some control over what was happening. And he could claim, and did claim, in terms of being able to do it and wanting to have a better police department, but it also gave him some control in terms of the inner workings of the police department to push back on that whole notion that he was an outsider, and it gave him a real good grip on the police department. And he did it. He exercised it. There was no question
So, Michael,
about that.
let me just ask you this. I mean, do you have a sense of kind of whether or not the kind of what Chief Ramsey's motivation was is related in any way to any of the kind of failures that you saw? I mean,
I don't know the full story. It's very interesting listening to Ron. I hadn't previously thought about bringing in the feds was a way of asserting control and having external eyes and ears, first the Justice Department and then my team, to help him doing the things that might have been more difficult for him to initiate on his own. So I think it's a very interesting perspective, and I am sure there is at least a kernel of truth in that, if not more than a kernel of truth in it. I mean, I guess my judgment ultimately is, did the department change? Did the department change for the better? Is it now better in terms of dealing with use of force, investigating use of force, and so forth than it was before? And I don't have any doubt that the answer to that is yes. Now, with respect to a couple of the other points that Ron made, yeah, we did look at, I think you're referring to the Office of Police Complaints, which used to be called OCCR, right, and now is the Office of Police Complaints. Mm-hmm. That's a civilian panel that has overlapping jurisdiction with the police department, with internal affairs within the police department. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a much ignored agency within DC. It doesn't have much power within DC government. Unfortunately, I think that's frequently the plight of those kinds of organizations in communities. And they're another one of those. I think they have a new leader who is actually a policing executive in Milwaukee, who I've been pretty impressed with in the couple of conversations I've had with him. He is now a non-voting member of the Use of Force Review Board, so he's going to be able to exercise some oversight in that capacity, and I hope he feels comfortable making recommendations if the Use of Force Review Board is not doing its job. Ron mentioned FIT. FIT is the Force Investigations Team, which is something that Chief Ramsey created in 1999, even before the Justice Department investigation was completed. And what he did was he assigned a very aggressive go-getter, Josh Ederheimer, to put this team together. And he got carte blanche to take homicide detectives, internal affairs people, whomever, and create this truly elite unit to work on serious use of force investigations. And they did terrific work. We reviewed every single FIT case that was worked on from 2002 to 2008. and we consistently found that they were of a very high quality. We were surprised when we went back last year, and I guess it was in the newspaper, but I missed it, that FIT had been consolidated with Internal Affairs back in 2012. First reason we were given is the caseload had declined. There were just fewer serious uses of force that they had been before, and therefore there just wasn't a budget rationale anymore to having a fairly substantial separate elite unit. And I think when you're an outside reviewer and you go in, you have to at least listen to those sorts of explanations, even if they may interfere with your sort of purist view of the world that really ought to be separate, really ought to be elite, it ought to be their only job. The second reason that we heard turned out, in my judgment, to be bogus, which was that senior command staff people had started to see a pattern of the FIT investigators finding in favor of the officer in too many cases. And so having a pro-officer bias, and that several cases had been reversed to reach a anti-officer conclusion where they found the use of force to be unjustified and outside of policy. And our reaction was, that's quite surprising. We never found that to be true in any of the investigations we reviewed. Do you have any examples of those? And let's just say that despite our pressing them repeatedly for specific cases that reflected that pro-officer bias, we never saw any. So if the serious use of force investigation function had not degraded in the way that it has, I would be perfectly fine with a merger into Internal Affairs. But it has degraded. And so given that I think Chief Lanier or any other leader has to have discretion, I think what they need to do, and I hope our report is a wake-up call to do that, is to bolster the use of force investigations training that the IAD people get now, because they're not getting the job done right now.
So I think it kind of raises this question, Phil, that you kind of think about is kind of about the enduring nature of these kinds of reforms and what's involved.
I think the big question that Mr. Bromwich's investigation addresses and answers in some sense is whether you can build an institution that keeps, that monitors itself and keeps active and keeps concerned over a long period of time, or whether you need some form of outside review to stimulate it. My answer to that is that if you have a police department and it's gone through some kind of review, I would hire Bromwich to, he used to be my student, but I would hire Bromwich to every 7 years, that's what it was in this case, do a review. And I think it's the outside, I think without the outside people, we just now have a good illustration of how it starts to break down. Now, let me read to you from Michael Bromwich's summary of his report. Because of limitations of, by the way, he points out that the number of killings and the number of shootings has gone way down. The number of killings in D.C. is 3, 4, 5. The number of shootings has gone down from 30 in 2004 to 15 in 2015. Shootings by the police. Okay, so something good's happening there. But he says, because of limitations of time and resources, we did not review all aspects of the Metropolitan Police Department's continued adherence to the Memorandum of Understanding. Instead, we selected issues that we considered among the most significant reforms embodied in the Memorandum of Understanding and implemented within the police department. Now, I'm just going to ridicule these one at a time as we go through. So you have to tell what's me and what's Mr. Bromwich. We focused on the adequacy of the Metropolitan Police Department's use of force policies. They did find that the policies on paper and maybe in training were well designed and were good policies and compared favorably to other police departments. No problem there. We focused on the Metropolitan Police Department's use of force investigations. That's what Mr. Bromwich just described as FIT, F-I-T. Way off. Used to be 5 years ago, 10 years ago, they had put together a great team that investigated to the satisfaction of the Inspector General of the Justice Department, who raved about it. Now it was way off. And it was way off because they had merged it into the old Internal Affairs Division. Not so good there. It's not holding up on its own. The operation of the Use of Force Review Board. The investigations go to the review board. The review board just wasn't working well at all, according to Mr. Bromwich. For one thing, they couldn't review any investigation until after the prosecutors had declined to prosecute it for fear that they would screw up the prosecution. But the result was that these cases were coming back to the police department for decision as to whether there should be discipline 2 years after they'd been sent out from the police department. And the people who knew something about it had long since disappeared or forgotten what they knew. So investigations, downhill. Operations of the Use of Force Review Board, to which the investigations go, downhill. System for dealing with at-risk officers, a very sensible idea that you identify an officer who has too many complaints against them, and you then meet with them, you talk to them, you keep your eye on them. Not working.
That's right.
System for dealing with the risk officer, that's that one. The operation of the Office of Risk Management, the office that in the long run was supposed to substitute for Bromwich's outside review. It was the one you were supposed to be able to rely on. An Inspector General function. Not working. So, killings down, way down. I mean, down from, I forget what it was at the start, 10 in a year or something.
Yeah, it was way more than that.
Okay, so killings way down, very good. Shootings cut in half at least, and more. But all the devices designed to keep this working are getting very rusty, as far as I can tell, and not doing their job. You need good investigations. You need a board that can decide whether someone should be disciplined. Has anybody been disciplined in the period of 15 years that you've seen it?
Oh, yeah, no. There's been plenty of people disciplined.
There have been.
Yeah.
And a lot of complaints about disparity of discipline, too.
Yeah.
All right, but no prosecutions.
There's never been a prosecution in the District of Columbia for an
right.
officer-involved shooting.
You certainly nailed that one, Mr. Brown.
So let me ask
Took me asking the question six
All right,
times to the U.S. Attorney's Office to
you
get an
my,
answer.
my picture.
So-
They're going to, I'm just going to say a sentence more, David. They're going to shape up because of Bromwich's report. But if Bromwich hadn't reported, there's no reason I see to think that they won't go steadily down in the devices that are intended to assure compliance with a good police commissioner's desires to reduce shootings and deaths and use of force. All the devices that were intended to make permanent what has worked temporarily, those are all going out of use. Bromwich will bring them back, but we have to bring Bromwich back to bring him back.
So in a way, the question is, first of all, whether 7 years is too long. I mean, so the problem is that once the backsliding starts, right, you're down a slippery slope. So so there's a question about whether it's a 2-year reviews or whether the reviews have to be routine. And to the extent that they have to be routine, it raises what I think is the more substantial question: is to what extent are the reforms actually taking hold? If they're dependent upon this constant review and this kind of call and response, are there real reforms taking place? Now, I understand the reduction. There are some reductions, But then that's where this kind of question of the community, I think, really comes in. Kind of what's the community's perspective on the department? But I'm
Right.
curious, whether.
Yeah, well, I think Phil's use of the word rusty is exactly right. It's not a word that I had thought of to apply to this before, but I think that's what happened. I think these reforms took quite a while to be adopted and to be implemented. It took a long time for some of them to be adequately implemented. For example, what are called chain of command use of force investigations. That is, investigation of these lower level uses of force out in the field, not by elite units like FIT or even IAD, but are done by lieutenants out in the districts. They had a very hard time figuring out how to bring those investigations up to a level that we found acceptable. I think at one stage, a couple of years into the monitorship, we found 16% of the investigations to be sufficient in our eyes. But that was raised dramatically over the next several years, so that it was upwards of 80% that we found to be sufficient. So I do think, and there are a number of mechanisms where you can do it, that you can use to do it, but there needs to be focus on these issues in a way that does not allow the rust to take hold, that reminds the police department that, of course, they've got other things to worry about: spikes in crime rates, new drugs in the city, new threats posed by gangs, but that these reforms are absolutely critical in order to maintain the integrity and the reputation of the police department. When a police officer does something wrong, the public has to have confidence that it's going to be investigated, it's going to be investigated carefully, and if the allegations are substantiated, that something's going to be done about it. And somebody may even lose their job over it. But that's the way the cookie crumbles. And unless there's that kind of confidence in the community, but also knowledge that that's what's going to happen in the police department, then you're nowhere.
So I do want to make sure that there's time for you all to ask some questions, but one final question. So if somebody were coming to you kind of saying, what are the lessons you learned? How would you, how can you help me in my department, kind of make sure that these things are sustained? What kind of specific recommendations would you give to a department?
Well, there's obviously, it's not one size fits all. I mean, and one of the huge advantages we had is that we knew this department because we'd been in it for 6 years, and we knew the chief because she'd been there at the end of this process. I think you'd have to go in, you'd need to have to talk to the leadership, but you'd also need to talk to a lot of the rank and file, and you'd need to talk to the community and find out, how are things going? I think we did a lot of reviews of paper investigations because of budget limitations. We didn't get to interview as many people in the department as I would have liked, and I always find that to be the most valuable source of information. And so, my recommendations to a chief in a different city would depend entirely on what I could glean from interviews and review of documents and talking to people in the community.
At least those three sectors.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
But I would say that about, I would say what Bromwich is raising, I would say, is the issue in the 20 or 30 major police departments that have been under monitors, that have been that same major kind of slippage, that you have seen certain decreases in, say, if it was use of deadly force, if it was those types of things. But the other institutional safeguards and guarantees that the institution need to have to be able to make sure that it doesn't happen again. Not just in terms of the reduction, but all of the safeguards that go along with the proper institution of the policies and practices. So if you were to look at Miami, if you were to look at LA, if you were to look at San Diego, if you were to look at Chicago, if you were to look at, they were in New York. I mean, I don't know how many times Justice has been in New York. This is unbelievable. But if you were to look at it, I would venture to say that the kind of things that we talk about in here would almost be relevant across the board. That if you name 6 of them, 2 of them, they would be having experience of. Because really, police departments, we know police departments don't have any control over whether crime goes up or goes down. So, and shootings have a tendency to take place use of force in police departments have a tendency to take place in a kind of rotating kind of way, that you can have a whole rash of shooting, and then you don't have to have any for 10 years. And so, if you look at the statistically at that, then you'll see a significant decrease. And then for 10 years, we won't have any shootings, and all of a sudden, one shooting will take place, and then 4 or 5 other shootings will take place. That's how it works. I mean, I experienced that in my department, and I've watched it across the nation last year. I mean, we almost had 1,000 shootings, and it just seemed to just take place in spots all the time. As soon as one would happen, then another one would happen.
We had 1,000 killings.
That's exactly right. That's what I'm talking about. So when we talk about
not just shootings, 1,000 killings.
Right, 1,000 killings. So if we talk, there was a whole bunch of more shootings, but there was 1,000 killings. So if you look at some of the things that the monitors were able to come out with in terms of the agreement, you would probably go back and evaluate, and we would still see those kind of rusty, using Phil's word, rusty kind of policies and practices that really wasn't ever sufficiently implemented, because to use the term you used earlier, it interferes with the culture of the organization, because they like to operate loosey-goosey and all that kind of stuff, and be able to make adjustments on things sometimes,
I think it would be a great idea, and I'd be happy to do this in other cities, in Detroit, Cincinnati, L.A., Pittsburgh, the other cities that have been in either under consent decrees or voluntary agreements. The problem is you have to have a will in those places to get it done. Not going to come from the police department in most cases. They will not want anybody looking over their shoulder, right? And it's frequently not going to be the mayor who doesn't want to find something he or she doesn't want to find. And so, in this case, it was the D.C. auditor who happened to have been somebody who was interested in police oversight from her tenure as an elected official. So the real question is, where is the impetus going to come from in these other cities?
I want to make sure you guys get to ask some questions, because I know you got to leave soon, but I do think that one thing is DOJ, and there's some Title VI questions, and there's some other ways into raising some questions that would get DOJ into this monitoring business. So questions. Okay, so I got 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm good. All right. So I'm okay. Sorry.
Sure. I'm Michael Goch. I'm at 2L. I had a question for Mr. Bromwich, which is, when you're investigating the quality of investigations or auditing the quality of audits, what are the markers of quality in those review functions that you're looking for? When you brought 18 up to 80, what changed?
We're looking for whether all significant witnesses have been interviewed, whether the interviews have been summarized in a way that makes sense, whether the overall case summary is a fair compilation of the information that's been obtained from those interviews, whether they've reviewed various documents that have been compiled as part of that event. So it's a very holistic review. And it's interesting, at the beginning of the monitorship, I actually thought that lawyers could do that. Lawyers can't do that because they just don't have the experience that police officers have in a department to know what the building blocks are for doing a credible use of force investigation. So I relied most heavily on what we call police practices experts, people with extensive experience in police departments doing exactly these kinds of investigations.
My name is Clarence Edwards. I have over 40 years of police experience at the county, state, and federal level. I think long before you reach the point where you're talking about a use of force investigation, you need to look at, if you want to reform police work, you need to look at who's being recruited, how they're being trained, how they're being supervised, and how they're being disciplined, and what impact does the community have in those 4 things. The community has to be involved. You can't allow the police department to decide things as important as that. Unfortunately, in many areas where the minorities are the focus of police investigations, the community is not involved. So the community has a responsibility to be involved, and they have to hold the police chief to task, hold the mayor to task for ensuring that you don't have disparate treatments based on race or some other criteria.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I'm not sure that, kind of what the scope of the community input was on the original, or on the monitoring.
Very little. I mean, I think it was unusual in that regard. I think most of the DOJ investigations and the monitorships have more community impetus from the outside. It's either a salient event or it's community dissatisfaction with the police generally. This really did begin with this Washington Post series. So there were pieces of the MOA, the Memorandum of Agreement, that dealt with making sure that citizens had the opportunity to file complaints, that the complaint forms were available at various places. We actually sent in people, disguised as regular people rather than members of the monitoring team to say, how do I file a complaint? And some of the original responses we got were completely inappropriate. And we criticized that and commented on it, so they shaped that up. But no, a surprisingly small component in this one.
During the pattern and practice investigations by the Special Litigation Branch, there's a component in there where sometimes the lawyers that work there would hold these community gatherings and bring people out to talk about the issues, and then they would have people there that would be sort of documenting what the issues are. But once the monitors came in, there's a part of that where the monitors can hold, because I know we did some of that in Cincinnati and a couple other places where we asked the monitors to meet with community people to talk about some of their perceptions as well as how all of that was going and what kind of influences the community had with the development of policies.
And we sent members of our monitoring team to community sessions, but we didn't get a lot of feedback, and in 6 years, we didn't have community organizations or even individual members of the community who I would have been happy to meet with approach us about this. So it was a little bit odd in that respect.
We have time for one more question. Does that sound right?
Michael Perloff.
Got it.
Thanks so much. My name is Michael Perloff. I'm a 2L here at the law school. I just wanted to ask a little bit about the leadership issue and how that ties into the holding people to the fire, because there are many departments where you might not have the quality of leadership you had in D.C. And I'm curious what you would recommend for those departments to address systematic problems in terms of policing.
Well, I have a view, it may be different from anybody else's here. If you don't have a good leader, if you don't have a good chief of police, you've got no chance to implement important reforms and make them stick. Where's it going to come from? I mean, police departments are paramilitary organizations, and if you don't have strong leaders who make it clear that these are priorities for them, it's just not going to get done. So I think it is sort of a preeminent requirement that you have strong leadership, and that if you don't see that the leadership is going to be able to emerge from within, why you may need to bring in an outside chief. And I know Ron has some reservations about that in the case of Chief Ramsey. Sometimes it makes sense to bring somebody in from the inside, but sometimes it makes sense to bring in somebody from the outset if you conclude that the whole command structure is broken and they're too set in their old bad ways to reform themselves.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And one of the things that I think we have to do in the selection process, in terms of individuals who are chiefs of police, look at their record. Look at the success and failure of their record. Good interview sessions in terms of their experiences and what they've gone through and what they didn't go through as rising through the ranks of leadership. And then once they get there, PERF, Police Executive Research Forum, just had a session in Washington some months ago where they invited 70 chiefs of police to Washington to talk about what's going on, the shootings and all of that. And they also said, bring someone with you. And when I looked at the list of the people who they brought with them, now I don't have anything wrong with Dr. King's daughter, Bernice. But I searched my memory and mine. I just don't know that she's been out on the front line talking about police brutality and shooting of people in, the shooting of people by police officers. And I'm not reducing her role as, running the peace center and all that kind of work. And surely she has a contribution to it. But I think the police chief ought to bring someone who he may not like, who is critical of his department and his work, Because if you're only talking to people who like you, then you're not getting a comprehensive critique of your leadership as well as your police department. We can't be playing kissy face with everybody. Sometimes people who don't want to kiss bring the best information. But our police chiefs don't seem to do that. And then there's a huge community out there of people, what I call police lovers. Police can't do no wrong. That's not true. Police do a lot of wrong things. Citizens don't always live up to their expectation either. But if we're sitting in the room and everybody's down there, police and civilians are on the same page, then that's not the room I want to be in. I want to be in the room where there's going to be some people that bring something different than what I bring, and I'm willing to listen to it, and people want to add, because ultimately the question is about improving the quality of police and police service in our community. And so we need to hear all voices in that. And chiefs aren't always as willing to hear that voice of criticism.
And you sort of expect these police chiefs who have, how many did you say, 75, 80?
70.
To bring with them a critic so that they can be exposed for their failings before 80 other police chiefs?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because that's the only way they're going to get better, Phil.
So, I mean, on that note, but I will say that if you make it a condition of the invitation,
That's exactly right.
that you. So, in any event, I mean, this is obviously something that we'll be talking about for a very long time. But I think we're really very fortunate to have had Mr. Bromwich with us today, and thank you all for coming. And have a good weekend.